The doctors told me my fertility was non-existent. My wife, Ava, spent 25 years hiding the fact that she had swapped my samples during our treatments, even conspiring with our greedy relatives to leave me penniless. She stood before everyone and claimed our son was not mine, so I calmly demanded a full family DNA test. I had already caught her on camera switching the samples decades ago and quietly switched them back, ensuring that the child she thought belonged to her first love was actually the son I shared with her sister, Hannah. My wife and I struggled for years to conceive a child. We tried everything imaginable, but nothing worked for us. Eventually, we decided that IVF was our only remaining option. I was shocked when I caught my wife red-handed before the embryo transfer even began. She was caught in the act of replacing my genetic material with a sample from her first love. For the next 2 decades, she lived under the delusion that she was carrying his biological child. I watched with a cold smile as she prepared to reveal the truth now that our son was an adult. She had no idea that I had swapped my samples back into the mix long ago. I had even taken the liberty of replacing her eggs with those of my first love, Hannah. I arrived back in Seattle with my son, David, after finishing a long-term medical residency abroad. The moment I walked through the front door, I stopped in my tracks. The house was packed with people, including distant relatives I had not seen in years. One would have assumed we were hosting a massive family reunion if they didn't know better. The most glaring sight was a man named Ethan sitting right in the center of our living room sofa with bloodshot eyes. My wife, Ava, who spent most of her time at high-end clubs, was draped over him. She was cradling him with a look of pure heartache and whispering sweet comforts into his ear. I raised an eyebrow and set my luggage down before asking Ava what the occasion was. I wanted to know why our home had become a circus in my absence. David stood behind me with his arms crossed and a frigid expression. His gaze cut through the room like a blade as he stared at Ethan. David had likely figured out the identity of this intruder immediately. My mother-in-law, Mrs. Harrison, sat in her usual chair looking miserable and struggling to find words. Before Ava could even say a word, Ethan stood up and walked toward David with tears streaming down his face. He cried out with forced emotion that he was David's biological father. David recoiled in disgust, as if he were trying to avoid a disease. His brow was furrowed in deep anger. He took another step back and spoke with a voice like ice. He told the man that he only had one father, and his name was James. My son proved exactly where his loyalties stayed in that moment. I squeezed David's hand and gave him a look to let him know I had everything under control. I then swung my fist and connected squarely with Ethan's jaw. The sound of the impact echoed through the silent room. My voice was freezing and my eyes were sharp as I told him to stop pretending to have a paternal bond. Ava jumped to her feet instantly. She rushed to help Ethan up while screaming at me. She asked me if I'd lost my mind and how I dared to touch him. She raised her hand to strike me, but David was far faster. He stepped between us and landed a sharp backhand across Ava's face. He hissed through gritted teeth, asking her how she dared to try and lay a hand on his father. David did not need to shout to exert a powerful sense of authority over the situation. Ava stood frozen in a mix of shock and pure rage. She lifted her hand to strike David this time, but Ethan caught her wrist. He put on a fake performance of being the peacemaker to look like the better man. Ethan told her not to hit him because he was their son. Seeing him play the role of a concerned father made me want to physically gag. Ava finally lowered her hand, but she kept her eyes locked on David with a freezing glare. She told David that he was only being spared a lesson because of his biological father's presence. I waited to see what would happen next. Ava took a deep breath, as if she were preparing for a grand performance. She reached out to link her arm with Ethan's while looking at him with feigned adoration. She announced to the room that she had a major revelation to share. She took a moment to let the tension build while scanning the faces of our relatives before settling her gaze on David and me. I remained silent and waited to see what kind of game she was playing this time. She finally spoke and declared that David was not my biological son. Her voice was quiet, but the words hit the room with the force of a massive explosion. David whipped his head around to look at me with a face full of utter confusion. I gave him a small gesture to remain calm and stay steady. Our relatives began to whisper among themselves instantly, like a pack of sharks sensing blood in the water. She went on to explain that when we underwent IVF years ago, she had faced a difficult choice. She claimed the doctors told her my samples were of poor quality. She told the crowd that she used Ethan's samples instead just to protect my fragile ego. This woman was a liar from the very beginning, and now she was trying to rewrite history. She wanted to frame her betrayal as an act of mercy toward me. Ava glared at me as if she were expecting me to have a public meltdown. I kept my expression entirely neutral, which forced her to continue with her scripted performance. She told the room that she had gathered them all to serve as official witnesses. She looked at Ethan with an expression of fake love before continuing her speech. She declared that it was time for David to acknowledge his real father. The room erupted into a cacophony of voices as relatives began to take sides. Some argued that if David wasn't mine, he belonged with Ethan. They pointed out that I had been holding a position in the Harrison family that I no longer deserved. They suggested it was time for me to step aside and give up my power. I had been running the Harrison Group with an iron fist for over 2 decades. Now that this supposed truth was out, they were eager to see me removed from the company. I could not help but let out a dry laugh when I heard their greedy suggestions. These people had been pushing for power for years, but I had kept them far away from the executive board. They were stuck living off their yearly dividends and had been nursing a deep hatred for me ever since. They were delighted by this drama and were hoping for a total collapse of my marriage with Ava. They saw this as their golden opportunity to claw their way back into the corporate office. David looked at the greed written on their faces and gripped my hand much tighter. I told everyone that David would always be my son regardless of what they said. My voice was calm, but it carried a weight that no one could ignore. Ethan let out a long and theatrical sigh before asking me how long I intended to live in denial. I was not the one living in a fantasy world because David truly was my biological son. Ava and Ethan really believed they were the masters of this deception. We only turned to IVF because Ava had been unable to conceive for years. Before the procedure was finalized, I walked in on Ava and a crooked nurse tampering with my biological samples. I stood in the shadows and listened to her call Ethan with excitement. She told him that she had successfully swapped my material for his. She spent her entire pregnancy convinced she was carrying Ethan's child. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing at how satisfied she looked with her little scheme. For 25 years, I watched her play the role of the devoted mother like a pathetic clown in a circus. I was perfectly happy to let her continue with her delusion. She thought she was the one in control, never realizing she was raising my son for free. Her shrill voice suddenly cut through my thoughts and brought me back to the present. She mocked me for being stubborn and told me that David did not share a single drop of my blood. She insisted that Ethan was the only father David had. I responded slowly and made sure my voice sounded as provocative as possible. I told her that she was clearly hallucinating if she believed that. Ava scoffed and challenged me to a DNA test to settle the matter. She also announced that she was filing for divorce because she was tired of being forced into this marriage. She claimed that 25 years of being my wife was more than she could handle. As she spoke about the divorce, a look of genuine excitement spread across her face. It was obvious that she had been dreaming of this moment for a very long time. It was hilarious to hear her talk about endurance when she had refused to share a bed with me for our entire marriage. I was the one who provided a home and a life for our son while she spent her nights with Ethan. I had spent decades building the Harrison name while she lived a life of leisure. I was the one working myself to the bone to make the Harrison Group a global success. Meanwhile, she was out drinking with trust fund kids at every club in the city. She was right about one thing, though. I never did any of this out of love for her. My marriage to her was a calculated move to secure a position within the Harrison family. It was the only way to gain full control over the corporation and its assets. Now that the company was firmly under my thumb, she had outlived her usefulness. Ava was nothing more than a spent asset to me at this point. I told her that I was perfectly fine with a divorce. I shrugged my shoulders to show her exactly how little I cared about losing her. I told her that a DNA test was a waste of time because I knew David was my son. David looked up at me with absolute trust in his eyes. He told me clearly that he believed me over anyone else in the room. The confidence on the faces of Ava and Ethan suddenly vanished into thin air. Ava desperately asked David if he really doubted his own mother's words. David ignored her completely and moved even closer to my side. A young man who appeared to be in his early 20s suddenly burst into the house. He ran directly toward David and addressed him as his brother. The entire room went silent as everyone stared at the newcomer. We had just dealt with a fake father, and now a supposed brother had appeared. I studied the young man and noticed he shared several facial features with Ethan. I suspected immediately that this was the illegitimate child Ava and Ethan had been hiding. They had done a remarkably good job of keeping him a secret for so many years. Ava's habit of staying out all night finally made sense in a dark sort of way. The situation was turning out to be much more elaborate than I had initially anticipated. Mrs. Harrison frowned and demanded an explanation from Ava about the young man's identity. The air in the room felt heavy and cold as everyone waited for an answer. The boy looked like he was on the verge of a breakdown with tears welling in his eyes. He choked out a greeting to David and introduced himself as Diego. He spoke with a trembling voice while stealing a nervous glance in my direction. He quickly looked down at the floor as if he were terrified of my reaction. Diego told David that their father spoke about him constantly and always praised his success. Ethan saw his opening and immediately put on a performance of a grieving father. He looked like he was in deep emotional pain. Ethan reached out and called David his dear son, while claiming he had missed him every single day. He looked like a man who had been through hell just to get to this moment. He added that Diego had also spent his life longing to meet his older brother. He claimed they had spent years watching David from the shadows of his life. Diego nodded eagerly and said he had even enrolled in the same university just to be near him. It was a disturbing revelation of years of stalking. He pulled a thick stack of photographs from his pocket and handed them to David with trembling hands. He told David that he had taken all of them in secret over the years. David took the pile and began to flip through them slowly. The photos capture moments from his graduation and candid shots of him after his basketball games. There were even pictures of him during his debate tournaments when he thought he was alone. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he realized he had been watched for years. The realization that a complete stranger had been following and photographing him was terrifying. Ava did not miss a beat and moved to stand beside her mother. She pointed at Diego and spoke with a tone of heavy importance. She told her mother that Diego was her true grandson and that she should acknowledge him in front of the whole family. Ava was a shark who knew exactly who held the power in the Harrison family. She knew my mother-in-law was the only one who could truly legitimize the boy. She had brought all the relatives together to create a high-pressure environment for her mother. Her goal was to force a public acknowledgement of Diego as a Harrison heir. She was convinced that once the matriarch spoke, the matter would be settled. She believed that if Diego was added to the family records, I would be powerless to stop it. She had watched me treat my mother-in-law with nothing but respect and devotion for 25 years. She assumed my loyalty would translate into silent obedience. Diego was quick to follow the lead and turned to address Mrs. Harrison as his grandmother. She looked at the boy for a moment before shifting her gaze toward me. Her eyes were filled with a complex mixture of doubt and concern. She refused to acknowledge the title he gave her immediately. I could tell that she was still on my side and didn't want to hurt me. I decided to step in and break the heavy silence before she was forced to answer. I told Ava that her plan to introduce this boy was clearly just a grab for the Harrison fortune. I asked her why she felt the need to involve David in her desperate schemes for money. It was obvious that the inheritance was the only thing she truly cared about. I turned to David and looked him straight in the eye to show my support. I told the room that even if the biological claims were true, David would remain my only legal heir. I made it clear that my loyalty to him was not dependent on a blood test. I announced that all of my personal properties and real estate would go to him. Every stock, every fund, and my entire 20% stake in the Harrison Group would be his one day. I wanted everyone to know that my wealth was spoken for. I asked David directly who he would choose if the allegations were proven true. I want to know if he would stay with me or go with his mother and her lover. My son processed the situation in an instant, and a spark of understanding lit up his eyes. He caught on to my plan immediately and threw his arms around me in a show of affection. He rested his head on my shoulder and spoke with a cheerful tone. He noted that since his mother had a new son, she probably didn't need him anymore. He said he knew she wouldn't leave him a dime of her inheritance, so he was choosing to stay with me. I felt proud of how quickly he had adapted to the situation. His clever response had completely shifted the power dynamic in the room. Ethan's eyes practically glowed with greed the moment I mentioned David getting my entire fortune. It was like a light had been switched on inside his head. He was well aware of exactly how much money and power I controlled. My collection of jewelry and real estate holdings alone were worth a small fortune. However, the 20% stake in the corporation was the real prize. To a man like Ethan, it was better than finding a literal gold mine. The greed was so obvious on his face that it was almost embarrassing to watch. Ethan leaned over to whisper a plan into Ava's ear. He reminded her how the late Mr. Harrison had split his majority stake to keep the family in check. He broke down the numbers by reminding her that David and I held 30% combined, while she only had 10. He pointed out that if I transferred my shares to David, our son would hold the largest block. This was the opening they were waiting for. He suggested that they could eventually trick David into giving them his shares once I was out of the picture. This would make Ava the majority shareholder with 40% of the company. Their first step was to pressure me into signing everything over to David. They wanted to leave me with nothing while they slowly pulled David into their sphere of influence. Ava went silent for a moment as she considered the potential of his plan. She eventually decided that his greedy strategy was actually quite brilliant. She stood up and put on a mask of motherly warmth for David's benefit. She promised him that Diego would never try to take any of the family fortune from him. She even went as far as to say she would leave her entire inheritance to him as well. She paused for effect before adding a single condition to her generous offer. She insisted that David must go through with the DNA test with Ethan. She said that if the results were positive, he would have to accept the truth. She told him that he would have to acknowledge Ethan as his father and treat him with respect from then on. David stole a quick glance at me to see how he should respond. I gave him a nearly invisible nod to tell him to play along. David agreed to the terms immediately, but added a clever condition of his own. He insisted that before any testing took place, we had to go to the notary's office. He wanted all the legal paperwork for the transfers completed beforehand. He demanded that all our assets be transferred to him as an irrevocable gift. I was incredibly impressed by his foresight and business sense in that moment. He knew that verbal promises meant nothing in a family as greedy as ours. The crowd of meddling relatives was now fully invested in the drama unfolding before them. They had already done the math and realized how much money was on the line. Their eyes were practically gleaming with the anticipation of a windfall. They were practically rubbing their hands together at the thought of all that wealth. They knew Ava was clueless about business and corporate management. If she gained control of the Harrison Group, they would be able to pick the company clean in months. One of my cousins started clapping and praised the plan as the perfect solution. Another relative didn't even wait to be asked before pulling out his phone. He started dialing a contact at a notary office to get the ball rolling immediately. The room became a beehive of activity as everyone began making arrangements for the legal transfer. It felt more like a celebration than a family crisis to them. Mrs. Harrison watched the chaos with a look of deep concern and tried to pull me aside to stop it. She asked me if I was absolutely sure about giving away everything I'd worked for. I gave her a reassuring smile and told her to trust my judgment. I promised her that I had a very specific plan in motion. My mother-in-law knew better than to doubt my capabilities after all these years. She went quiet once she saw the absolute confidence in my eyes. With the enthusiastic help of our relatives, the paperwork was drafted to transfer everything but a small sum for our basic needs. Every single one of our assets was officially notarized and moved into David's name. While we were at the office, Ava and Ethan watched David with a look of predatory affection. They were already picturing him as their personal ticket to the high life. It was as if they could already see him sitting at the head of the Harrison Group board. They were imagining a future where they controlled the entire city through him. Neither of them could stop smiling at the thought of their impending power. I watched them lost in their little fantasies and then looked at my son who had just become a billionaire. I couldn't help but smile along with them. I decided that merely taking Ava's inheritance wasn't nearly enough punishment for her. I was planning to dismantle Ethan's life piece by piece until he had nothing left. I looked at him and reminded him of his claims of fatherly love for David. I suggested it was time for him to put his money where his mouth was. I spoke in a casual tone while my eyes searched his lying face for any sign of shame. I reminded him that I had been paying for his son's lifestyle for over 20 years. I noted that the bill for raising David easily ran into the millions. I told him I wouldn't even ask for a reimbursement for myself as long as he gave David a significant gift. I stated that since David was my favorite person, he deserved to be compensated for his lost years. David took that as his cue and jumped right into the conversation. David addressed Ethan and mentioned that his decades-long affair with Ava must have resulted in some savings. He pointed out that they were already at the notary's office anyway. It seemed like the perfect time to make a legal transfer of funds. He asked Ethan if he was going to prove his sincerity with a financial gesture right then and there. He warned that without such a gesture, he would have to doubt Ethan's true intentions. He questioned if Ethan actually cared about him or just the Harrison family name. He asked if Ethan was only interested in the vast Harrison estate that now belonged to him. Ethan was caught completely off guard and found himself in a very difficult position. He was clearly agonized at the thought of parting with his own money. He knew that if he refused, David would never trust him or let him into his life. After a long moment of painful hesitation, he finally gave in. He gritted his teeth and pulled a bank card from his wallet to hand to David. He told David that he loved him and that the card contained $5 million he had saved over a decade. David took the card from him without a single word of thanks. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He immediately summoned the notary to include the $5 million in the official asset transfer documents. Ethan was forced to stand there with a pained expression that he tried to pass off as a smile. He looked like he was suffering through a major surgery without any anesthesia. Ava was the one who selected the facility for the DNA testing because she didn't trust me. She picked the most prestigious forensic lab in the state to ensure the results were ironclad. She wanted to make sure I couldn't bribe anyone to change the outcome. I stood in the corner with a cold smile and admired her choice of such a reputable location. Once the technicians had finished drawing samples from Ethan, David, and myself, I made a new demand. I insisted that Ava also provide a sample to be compared against David's DNA. Ava looked at me as if I had completely lost my mind and insisted that David was obviously her child. I just looked back at her and let a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. I knew exactly what the results were going to show. I told her that since we were already at the lab, we might as well be thorough and check everything. David wasn't sure why I was insisting on testing Ava's DNA as well. However, he trusted me enough to know that I had a very good reason for it. He played along and started acting like a spoiled heir, refusing to proceed unless Ava was tested too. Since Ava was currently obsessed with staying on David's good side, she had no choice but to agree. She reluctantly allowed the nurse to take her blood sample. Diego was waiting outside the clinic with a massive bouquet of flowers when we finally finished. He put on a fake smile and greeted David as his brother with far too much energy. He was clearly trying to cement his place in David's new life. He tried to shove the flowers into David's hands and moved in for an unwelcome hug. David looked like he was about to be sick as he pushed the boy away with significant force. He told Diego to keep his hands off him because he found his touch repulsive. Diego was a bit taller than David and had a very polished arrogant look about him. He acted as though they had been best friends for years instead of strangers. Ethan stepped in quickly to try and lower the tension between the two boys. He told David that Diego was his brother and that family members were supposed to love and support one another. David didn't even bother with a polite response and just rolled his eyes in disbelief. He had no interest in being part of their manufactured family. I reminded them that the DNA results weren't back yet and that they shouldn't be so quick to claim a relationship. I told them to enjoy their little family reunion while I took my leave. I had no intention of sticking around to listen to their lies. I told Ava it was time to head to the courthouse and finalize our divorce papers. Since all the assets and parental rights had been settled at the notary's office, there was nothing left to negotiate. Our legal separation was going to be remarkably quick and simple. We finished the paperwork at the courthouse in record time and walked out with our official divorce decree. Ethan looked like he had just won the lottery and couldn't hide his excitement. He seemed genuinely shocked that I let Ava go so easily. He probably expected a long and drawn-out legal battle over our assets. He watched with clear jealousy as David stayed close to my side throughout the entire process. The obvious bond between us was clearly eating him alive from the inside. Ethan waited until David had left for the parking garage before he finally approached me. He couldn't resist the urge to get one final insult in while no one else was listening. He spoke with a smug and condescending tone that made his arrogance clear. He told me that Ava had never felt anything for me and that he was the only man she had ever loved. Ava leaned against him and gave me a triumphant smile that showed she agreed with every word. They really believed they had finally won. Ava stated that David would come running to them as soon as the DNA results proved his parentage. Diego dropped his humble act and gave me a look of pure contempt. He was no longer hiding his true nature now that the legal work was done. He reminded me that all the Harrison wealth was now in David's name and that I would soon be homeless. I didn't even bother to respond to such a childish and predictable taunt. I just waited for the car to arrive so I could leave them behind. Ava took my silence as a sign of defeat and decided to reveal her full plan. She told me that my era of running the Harrison Group was over and that it was their turn to lead. She was already mentally spending the company's profits. I asked her if she had really used our son as a pawn just to steal the corporation for herself. She just scoffed and asked me what I intended to do about it. She clearly felt that she was untouchable now that the transfers were signed. She reminded me that David was now the legal owner of everything we once shared. She claimed that once the paternity test proved Ethan was his father, she would effectively control the entire Harrison Group. She was already acting like the CEO. I stared at her with a blank expression and told her that I would be watching her progress with interest. I said we would see if her luck was actually strong enough to keep a hold on the company. I knew the storm that was coming for her was one she couldn't possibly survive. They were so confident in their petty little schemes that they acted as if they had already won. They had no idea that they were walking into a trap I had set decades ago. From the very start, they never stood a single chance of coming out on top. While I was finalizing my paperwork at the office, Diego burst in and caused a scene. He literally ordered the general manager to leave his post and vacate the room. He then slumped into the executive leather chair as if he owned the building. He sat there with his feet on the desk and announced that David had appointed him as the new general manager. The staff were too stunned and intimidated to challenge him. I decided it was the perfect time to give the young man a reality check. I gave a simple order to the security team to have him removed from the premises immediately. Several guards stepped forward and grabbed him to escort him out of the building. He jumped up and began screaming at them while pointing his finger aggressively. He screamed at the guards and asked them if they had any idea who he was. He shouted that his brother was the chairman and that he was a Harrison by blood. He called the security team every name in the book for trying to do their jobs. He turned his rage on me and called me a washed-up loser who had been exiled from the family. He questioned my authority to give orders to anyone at the Harrison Group now that I had no legal standing. He was convinced he was already untouchable. He started getting physical with the guards and even tried to lunge at me across the desk. I was about to handle the situation myself when David walked into the room. He took one look at the chaos and asked in a freezing voice what was going on. Diego instantly transformed from a screaming maniac into a pathetic victim. He told David that I was trying to have him thrown out like a common criminal. David didn't look sympathetic at all as he stared at the boy with a cold gaze. David told him that this was a place of business and that his behavior was completely unacceptable. He added very clearly that he was not Diego's brother. At that moment, Ethan's voice rang out from the doorway as he criticized David's tone. Ethan stepped into the room and told David that he needed to treat his brother with more respect. He suggested that David should rely on Diego's help to manage the corporation in the future. He claimed that without family by his side, David would be vulnerable to his enemies. David let out a short laugh and told the security team to throw both of them out of the building. Ethan realized that his emotional appeal had failed and his voice became aggressive and demanding. He was not going to leave without a fight. He declared that as Ava's husband and David's biological father, he was the rightful heir to the Harrison Group. He claimed that half of the entire company belonged to him by right. I just sat back and watched his desperate power grab with a cold smile. I told the guards to get them out before they made the lobby look even worse than it already did. The security team didn't hesitate for a second because they knew exactly who was actually in charge. They grabbed both men and dragged them toward the exit without another word. Ethan's screams could still be heard echoing from the hallway as they dragged him away. He yelled that he would make me crawl back to him once the DNA results were released the next day. He promised to make me beg for scraps once he was in control of the family fortune. I watched him being hauled away and told him that I was just as excited to see the results as he was. The following day was the one Ethan had been obsessing over for years. It was supposed to be the moment his life changed forever. I woke up early and carefully selected one of my best suits for the occasion. I wanted to look my absolute best while I watched his entire world crumble around him. Ava had invited nearly every relative we had to the lab to witness her supposed victory. She clearly thought she was setting the stage for my public humiliation. Her arrogance was almost pathetic because she didn't realize she was the one about to be shamed. She had provided a massive audience for her own spectacular downfall. I decided to taunt her a bit before the results were revealed and reminded her that she had chosen this specific lab. I told her that once the documents were opened, there would be no room for her to complain or question the findings. She looked at me with absolute certainty. Ava held her head high and vowed that she would stand by the results of the test. I had to suppress a laugh at her misplaced confidence in her own lies. She was walking straight into a wall, and she had no idea it was even there. Ethan couldn't even wait for the official announcement before he started playing the part of the long-lost father. He draped his arm around Ava's shoulders with an air of smug possessiveness. He began to speak to the gathered relatives in a voice full of fake gravity. He told Ava that their family would finally be whole once the truth was officially revealed. He made sure to give me a look of pure triumph, as if the battle were already over. I ignored his childish behavior and focused my attention on David. David remained completely unimpressed and looked like he would rather be anywhere else in the world. Ethan clearly expected us to be devastated by his words and was visibly bothered by our lack of reaction. The silence that followed his little speech was incredibly awkward for him. He quickly recovered his composure and told David that he would be his father from that day forward. He promised that he would provide David with anything his heart desired once they were officially a family. It was a transparent attempt to buy David's affection. He pulled an expensive-looking gift box from his pocket and offered it to David. He told him it was a custom watch he had purchased to commemorate their first day as father and son. He looked at David with an expectant smile and asked if he liked it. David didn't even glance at the box before telling Ethan that he had no use for his gifts. The fake smile on Ethan's face vanished and was replaced by a look of pure shock. Ava jumped in immediately to try and save the situation. She tried to explain that Ethan was just trying to be kind, but David cut her off before she could finish. He told her that he had no interest in anything Ethan had to offer. He stated firmly that James was the only man he would ever call his father. A surge of pride washed over me as I watched my son defend our bond. David had proven his loyalty to me time and time again. Just then, A technician emerged from the lab holding several sealed envelopes. Ethan, Ava, and Diego all leaned forward with intense anticipation. Their eyes were locked onto the test results like hungry predators watching their next meal. They were practically vibrating with excitement. They gave me one last look of smug satisfaction, as if they had already won. They were clearly picturing my public humiliation, followed by their own ascension to the top of the Harrison Group. I had to work hard to keep a straight face. I was on the verge of laughing at the sheer absurdity of their confidence. The technician began to open the first envelope, and the room went completely silent. Ethan's breathing became heavy, and Ava's hands were visibly trembling with excitement. Her face turned a bright shade of red as she whispered to David about them finally becoming a real family. She gave me a look of pure pity, as if I were a pathetic animal about to be put down. It was a truly delusional performance. Ethan was even more dramatic as he started to shake with what he thought was paternal emotion. He kept repeating to David that he was finally going to be able to prove his true identity. He was acting like a hero in his own twisted story. Diego was too impatient to wait for the reading and rushed over to David's side. He excitedly told David that he expected to be named the new general manager as soon as they took over the company. He was already planning his new career. He reminded David that they were brothers and that he was the only person David could truly trust to run the business. He spoke with a sense of entitlement that was as offensive as it was arrogant. He clearly felt the position was already his. He talked about the executive position as if it were a guaranteed appointment. I watched the three of them make fools of themselves and found the whole situation incredibly entertaining. They were celebrating a victory that didn't exist. They had no clue that they were the actual victims of this entire drama. It wouldn't be until the final results were read that they would realize how badly they had lost. The truth was about to hit them like a freight train. The technician cleared his throat and prepared to read the official findings to the group. He began by announcing the results of the paternity test between Ethan and David. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. The technician paused for a moment, which caused Ethan and Ava to lean forward in their chairs. They were practically falling over themselves to hear the words they had been waiting for. They were focused entirely on his every breath. Every relative in the room was holding their breath and waiting for the moment of my downfall. The technician continued reading and stated clearly that there was no biological relationship between Ethan and David. The words hung in the air for a long second. The atmosphere in the room turned to ice in an instant. Ava's eyes bulged out, and she let out a piercing scream of denial. She kept shouting that there had to be some kind of mistake at the lab. Ethan stood there in a state of total shock and confusion. He started stammering about how it was impossible for them not to share the same blood. His face went completely white as the first waves of terror began to set in. Diego snatched the official report from the technician's hand and read it for himself. He collapsed back into his chair as the reality of the situation sunk in. He kept whispering to himself that they must have read the names wrong. I calmly asked the technician to proceed to the next set of results. He raised his voice to ensure everyone in the room heard the next part. He announced that according to the DNA analysis, David and I were indeed biological father and son. The room erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers as the relatives tried to make sense of the news. Ava looked as though she had been struck by lightning. She was stuck in a loop and could only repeat the word impossible over and over again. I looked over at David and then at my confused mother-in-law. I decided to be helpful and explain exactly what had happened. I told Ava that I had seen everything when she tried to tamper with my samples at the clinic. I informed her that I had swapped the samples back to their original state before the procedure was completed. I watched with satisfaction as the color drained from her face. I wasn't finished with her yet and decided to deliver the final blow. I casually mentioned that I had also taken the opportunity to replace her eggs with those belonging to my first love. A terrifying silence descended over the entire hall as everyone processed the implications. The revelation was more than any of them were prepared for. My mother-in-law looked up at me with eyes wide with shock and confusion. I turned my attention back to Ava and spoke slowly to ensure she understood every word. I told her that David was not her biological child and never had been. I congratulated her on spending 25 years raising a child that didn't belong to her. Ava lunged forward and tore the third report out of the technician's hands. She needed to see the proof with her own eyes. Her eyes turned a terrifying shade of red as she read the negative result. She lunged at me with her hand raised to strike my face. She screamed at me and called me every vile name she could think of. I caught her wrist with ease and gave her a forceful push that sent her to the floor. She sprawled out on the ground as I looked down at her with nothing but contempt. I felt no pity for the woman who had tried to ruin me. Ethan looked like a man whose entire world had just vanished before his eyes. He grabbed onto Ava as if she were the last thing keeping him from drowning. He began to speak in a desperate and broken voice. He argued that if David wasn't her biological child, he had no claim to the Harrison estate. He claimed that this meant Diego was the only remaining heir to the family fortune. He held her wrist with a grip that looked painful as he tried to convince her. Ava's mind began to race as she realized there was still a chance to secure the money. A look of pure malice appeared in her eyes as she stood up. She walked toward my mother-in-law, who was still trying to grasp the situation. She told her mother that everyone in the room was a witness to the fact that David was not her son. She pointed a trembling finger at me while screaming at the top of her lungs. She was desperate to turn the situation back in her favor. She claimed that David was just a bastard child I had fathered with another woman. She insisted that the Harrison family business could never be handed over to someone who wasn't a biological member of the family. Ethan and Diego immediately started shouting their support for her claims. They demanded that David be removed from the family line immediately. Diego started shouting that he was the only legitimate heir left to take over the company. My mother-in-law finally seemed to snap out of her state of shock and looked at the three of them. She ignored Ava's screams completely and focused all her attention on me. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions, and she looked more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. She asked me with a trembling voice if everything I had said was the absolute truth. It pained me to see her so distressed after all the years she had supported me. I told her with a heavy heart that everything was true. Ava was furious that her mother wasn't immediately agreeing with her demands. She grabbed her mother's arm and started shaking her while demanding that she name Diego as the new heir. My mother-in-law took a deep breath and regained her usual composure. She looked at Ava with a cold and steady gaze. She pulled her arm away and asked Ava if she actually knew the identity of my first love. Ava was so blinded by rage that she just stamped her foot like a child. She said she didn't care about my past relationships as long as David was out of the picture. She screamed that it didn't matter who the woman was because David was clearly not hers. My mother-in-law looked her in the eye and told her that my first love was her own sister, Hannah. The revelation was like a physical blow to everyone in the room. She declared that David was a biological Harrison and therefore the only rightful heir to the family legacy. This news hit the relatives like a second explosion and sent them into a new wave of frantic whispering. Ava looked like she was about to faint. She reminded everyone that the Harrison family tradition had always favored the children of the primary line. She explained that while gender no longer mattered, the inheritance was reserved for the direct descendants of the original marriage. This rule had been in place for generations. She told Ava that she was only ever a backup option because she was an illegitimate child. She looked at Ava with a gaze that was as sharp as a razor and full of warning. She made it clear that Ava's status in the family was far lower than she had believed. She reminded her that she was only brought into the Harrison home because Hannah had been incapacitated. She told Ava that she was a replacement and nothing more. She warned her never to forget her true place in the family hierarchy. The mention of her actual origin caused Ava to turn even whiter than before. Her father had been a victim of a manipulative secretary in his younger years, which resulted in her birth. She was a secret that the Harrison family had tried to hide for a long time. The prestigious Harrison family had no intention of ever officially recognizing an illegitimate child. Her father had provided for her financially, but he had never given her a single moment of his time or affection. She had grown up as a ghost in the shadows of the Harrison name. However, a tragic twist of fate changed everything when Hannah was left in a coma after an accident. With no other heirs available to continue the line, her father was forced to bring Ava into the fold. It was an act of desperation rather than love. He gave her a choice to join the family on the condition that she married me. My father had saved his life years ago, and he felt a profound debt of gratitude to my family. He wanted to ensure that I would be the one to manage his legacy. Ava had absolutely no feelings for me because she was already deeply in love with Ethan. She hated the idea of being tied to me, but she knew that the Harrison name was her only ticket to wealth. She chose greed over her own heart and agreed to the arrangement. She pretended to return my affection just enough to make the marriage seem believable. Ethan had originally treated her like trash because of her poor background, but he changed his tune the moment she became a Harrison. He came crawling back to her as soon as he smelled the money. Ava remained completely devoted to Ethan even after we were married. The only reason we used IVF was because she refused to ever let me touch her. She was determined to remain biologically exclusive to Ethan while living off my hard work. The two of them had spent years planning to take over the Harrison estate once her father passed away. They had no idea that the old man had seen right through their schemes. He had taken precautions to protect the company from people like them. He divided the voting shares in a way that kept any one person from having total control. He also named me the sole chairman and gave me absolute authority over the corporation's operations. He even included a legal clause that barred Ava from ever holding an executive position. Ava had spent the last 2 decades living off her dividends while being completely excluded from the decision-making process. She had the title and the lifestyle, but she had zero actual power in the company. This had fueled a deep and bitter resentment within her. Ava refused to accept the truth and continued to scream her denials at her mother. She demanded to know why she should believe anything that came out of my mouth. She was desperate for any reason to doubt the reality of the situation. I gave her a look of pure disgust and reached into my bag for one last document. I pulled out a certified DNA report and held it up for everyone to see. I told her that it was the official proof of David's biological link to Hannah. I laid the report out on the table and invited anyone to examine it for themselves. I told Ava that since Hannah was still in her care facility, we could easily perform another test to verify the results. I challenged her to call any lab she wanted to perform a new analysis. I stated that David's status as a biological Harrison was now a proven fact that no one could argue with. Ethan and Diego looked like they had been hit by a truck as the realization sunk in. They had never considered the possibility that David was actually Hannah's child. Mrs. Harrison maintained her stoic appearance, but I could see tears of relief welling in her eyes for a split second. The relatives began to whisper with a new sense of excitement about the family's future. The dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. They began to acknowledge that David was the one true heir to the entire Harrison fortune. They openly mocked Ava and said she was nothing more than an illegitimate child with no hope of ever controlling the company. Their loyalty switched to David in an instant. The looks of disgust and contempt from the relatives were almost tangible as they stared at Ava. She looked as though all the life had been drained out of her as she collapsed onto the floor. Her eyes were blank and unfocused as her world ended. She had spent her life waiting for the moment David would acknowledge her as his mother and Ethan as his father. Now, she had lost every bit of leverage and power she once possessed. Ethan and Diego looked like defeated men with no hope left. Our relatives finally realized that Ava was no match for me and that she was now a liability. They knew that staying by her side would only bring them ruin. One by one, they stood up and hurried out of the room to distance themselves from her. Ava stared at me for a long time in a state of total shock. Eventually, a look of desperate determination appeared on her face as she forced a fake smile. She crawled toward me and tried to regain some scrap of her old life. She started to plead with me and claimed that she knew I still loved her deep down. She tried to frame her betrayals as minor disagreements about her social life and her relationships with other men. She was desperately trying to salvage whatever she could. She promised to cut off all contact with Ethan if I would only allow her to stay in the family. I looked down at her with a sense of pity that was almost overwhelming. I spoke very slowly to make sure she felt the weight of my words. I told her very clearly that she was wrong and that I had never loved her for a single second. Her face turned a sickly shade of white as she struggled to process what I had said. Her lips were trembling as she begged me to repeat myself. She demanded to know why I'd spent years looking at her with such intensity if I didn't love her. I told her with a cold and steady voice that the only reason I looked at her was because she resembled Hannah. She was nothing more than a living shadow of the woman I actually loved. I confessed that I had used her as a tool to cope with my own grief over losing Hannah. I explained that our marriage was a strategic move to protect Hannah's legacy from her greedy relatives. She was just a placeholder in my grand design. She was the only way for me to gain a legitimate foothold in the Harrison family. I needed the title of son-in-law to seize control of the corporation and keep the other relatives at bay. Every move I made was calculated to ensure the company remained under my control. I told her I knew she had always wondered why her father had chosen me over his own children. I mentioned how her mother had always treated me with more affection than she had ever shown Ava. I was ready to reveal the final piece of the puzzle. She had no idea about my history with the family because she had been excluded from their lives as a child. Even though I grew up in a small town, her father had brought me to their estate every summer to repay the debt he owed my father. I was raised alongside Hannah as a member of the family. Hannah and I were childhood sweethearts who had been destined for each other from the start. Her parents had loved me like a son and had prepared me to one day run the company alongside their daughter. I had received the exact same elite education and training as the true Harrison heir. I laughed at the sheer absurdity of her thinking I was some poor social climber from the sticks. She actually believed that I was desperate for the Harrison name out of some sense of gratitude. She never realized that I had been the chosen successor all along. I told her the most hilarious part of all was her belief that I ever actually loved her. Ava stood frozen in place as her entire perception of our marriage was destroyed. She had spent 25 years convinced that she held total power over my heart. She finally understood that she was nothing more than a convenient stand-in for the sister she had replaced. Every luxury she had enjoyed was the result of a massive deception I had orchestrated. Now that the truth was out, she realized she had absolutely nothing left to her name. Ava's mind finally snapped under the weight of the revelation. Our entire marriage had been a carefully choreographed performance that lasted for over 2 decades. The show was finally over, and it was time for her to face the cold reality of her situation. I ordered the staff to pack her bags and remove her from the estate immediately. I turned to Mrs. Harrison and told her about the medical research project I had been funding overseas. I had been working on a breakthrough that would change our lives forever. I explained that the project focused on advanced neurological stimulation to wake patients from long-term comas. She looked up at me with a sudden spark of hope that had been missing from her eyes for years. She knew exactly who I was talking about. She asked me if I really meant what she thought I meant, and I gave her a firm nod. I told her that Hannah had already responded incredibly well to the new treatments I had arranged. The doctors were confident that she would be coming back to us very soon. My mother-in-law broke down in tears of pure joy while repeating Hannah's name over and over. Meanwhile, Ava was wandering the streets after being unceremoniously dumped from the only home she had ever known. She was finally experiencing the life she had once fled. She walked through the city in a state of total shock as her life of luxury vanished into thin air. She eventually found her way back to the small apartment she had shared with Ethan all those years ago. However, there was no warm welcome waiting for her there. Ethan was waiting for her with a look of pure hatred and began screaming at her for losing their fortune. He called her a fool and blamed her for the fact that they were now penniless. Ava whipped around to face him with eyes full of rage and tears. She screamed back at him and asked how he could possibly blame her for his own plan to switch the samples. She told him that his greed was the only reason they were in this mess. Ethan stood there in shock as she turned all her anger toward him. He reminded her that she had been an eager participant in the plan from the very beginning. Ava grabbed his arm and let out a shrill scream, telling him to shut his mouth. She was past the point of rational conversation. She yelled that their past arguments didn't matter because they were now completely broke. She asked him how he expected them to survive on the small amount of cash they had left. Ethan pushed her away with a look of total disgust. He asked her what she suggested they do and mocked the idea of either of them actually getting a job. Ava slumped against the wall as she realized he was right. They were both completely incapable of living a normal, hard-working life. She had spent her entire adult life as a wealthy socialite and had no idea how to exist without money. Ethan suddenly had a thought and remembered the $5 million he had given to David. He realized that the money was technically still within their reach if they could get to him. Ava's eyes lit up with a new sense of hope, and she agreed that they had to find David immediately. They rushed across town to David's luxury apartment and began pounding on his door. They stood there ringing the bell repeatedly until he finally answered. David opened the door, looking bored, and didn't seem surprised to see them at all. He asked them what they wanted in a voice that was entirely indifferent. Ethan shoved past him and stormed into the living room like he still owned the place. He started screaming at David to give him back his $5 million immediately. David just let out a cold laugh and asked him why he should ever return a gift. Ethan was shaking with rage as he pointed a finger at David's face. He hissed through his teeth that the money belonged to him and him alone. David ignored the outburst and casually sat down on his designer sofa. He crossed his legs and looked at them with an expression of pure boredom. He reminded Ethan that the money had been legally signed over as an irrevocable gift at the notary's office. He stated clearly that he had absolutely no legal or moral obligation to give a single cent back. Ethan felt a wave of dizziness wash over him as his last hope vanished. His temper finally exploded, and he began to stammer in a blind rage. He pointed at David while trying to form a coherent sentence, but his voice failed him. Suddenly, a sharp and agonizing pain shot through his chest. His vision went dark, and he collapsed onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. Ava stood frozen for a second before letting out a blood-curdling scream. She threw herself onto his body and began wailing his name in a total state of hysteria. David watched the scene unfold without a single hint of emotion on his face. He calmly pulled out his phone and dialed emergency services to report the medical crisis. After giving them the address, he simply sat back down and picked up his book as if nothing had happened. The lack of money caused Ava and Ethan to turn on each other with a new level of viciousness. They spent their remaining cash within weeks, and Ava found herself truly penniless for the first time in her life. She was living a nightmare she couldn't escape. Ethan made it clear that he had no intention of finding a job to support her lifestyle. He even threatened to kick her out onto the street if she didn't start contributing to the rent. He was finished with being her provider. I decided to be helpful and had a headhunter reach out to offer Ava a low-level service job. A few weeks later, I invited David out for dinner at a trendy new spot downtown. I was in such a great mood on the way there that I couldn't stop humming to myself. David noticed my cheerful demeanor and asked me what was making me so happy. I told him that we were going to enjoy some very high-quality entertainment along with our dinner. He looked at me with a curious expression. We were seated in a private booth on the second floor that overlooked the restaurant's main dining area. I gestured for David to look through the glass at the staff working below. He immediately spotted Ava among the waitstaff. She was dressed in a cheap uniform and was running around serving heavy trays of food to demanding customers. David looked back at me with a raised eyebrow and asked if this was the big surprise I had promised. I told him to be patient because the Real show was just beginning. A few minutes later, Ethan walked through the front door with a much younger woman on his arm. They were leaning into each other and laughing as if they didn't have a care in the world. They looked like a couple in the middle of a honeymoon phase. Ava noticed them immediately, and her entire body went rigid with shock. She screamed Ethan's name and demanded to know what he was doing at her workplace. Ethan didn't even bother to look in her direction as he continued his conversation with his date. He kept flirting with the woman as if Ava were a complete stranger. Ava's voice became a shrill screech as she yelled at him to answer her. She was quickly becoming the center of a very embarrassing scene. Ethan finally looked up with an expression of pure annoyance. He snapped at her and asked if she was blind since he was clearly trying to enjoy a meal. He treated her with the same contempt she had once shown to her servants. Ava pointed a shaking finger at the woman beside him and tried to ask who she was. Ethan gave her a cruel and arrogant grin that showed he didn't care about her feelings at all. He looked like he was enjoying her public breakdown. He asked her what his relationship with Susan had to do with her. Ava's face turned a deep purple as she demanded to know exactly what was going on between them. She was on the verge of a total meltdown in the middle of the restaurant. Ethan casually informed her that Susan was his girlfriend and asked if she had a problem with that. Ava staggered backward as if he had physically struck her. The reality of his betrayal was more than she could handle. She looked like she was in physical pain as the word girlfriend echoed in her head. She couldn't believe that he had moved on so quickly after everything they had been through. Ethan just continued to stare at her with a provocative and mocking expression. He asked her why she thought he wouldn't have a partner of his own. He revealed that he and Susan had actually been together for over 20 years. He confessed that every cent he had ever taken from Ava had gone towards supporting Susan's lifestyle. He stopped for a moment to let that sink in before delivering another devastating revelation. He told her that her miscarriage years ago had actually been planned by him. It was the final betrayal in a lifetime of lies. He admitted that he had tampered with the truck that caused the accident just to ensure she lost the baby. Ava's face turned a ghostly white as her entire world collapsed. She looked like a hollow shell of a person as she processed the horror of his actions. She could only stare at Ethan in a state of absolute shock and mental collapse. Susan didn't miss the chance to kick her while she was down and told her she was nothing more than a pathetic backup plan. She laughed at Ava's misery with a cruel and heartless sneer. Ava felt her entire existence crumbling around her as she realized she had been played for a fool. The man she had sacrificed everything for had never loved her. Even the son she had raised out of duty and greed wasn't actually hers. The past 25 years of her life had been a total waste and a cruel joke. A blind and murderous rage suddenly replaced her shock and consumed her mind. She was no longer in control of her own actions. She sprinted into the kitchen and grabbed a heavy chef's knife before anyone could stop her. She burst back into the dining room with the weapon held high. She lunged at Ethan with a scream of pure agony and hatred. She began to stab him repeatedly while screaming that he was a monster who had destroyed her life. She shrieked that he had taken everything from her and she wanted him to suffer. The other diners began to scream and run for the exits in a panic. Ethan's screams of pain filled the restaurant as his clothes were quickly soaked in blood. David watched the horrific scene unfolding below us with a look of absolute shock. He couldn't believe the level of violence he was witnessing. I remained perfectly calm and took a slow sip of my tea as if nothing were wrong. The police arrived within minutes and managed to tackle Ava and take the knife from her hands. They led her away in handcuffs as she continued to scream and weep. David was still trembling with shock as he asked me if this was the entertainment I had promised. I set my teacup down on the table and looked him in the eye with a very serious expression. I spoke in a quiet and steady voice that commanded his attention. I told him that I wanted him to learn a very important lesson about dealing with enemies. I stated that he must never show mercy to those who have tried to destroy him. David looked at me with a confused and troubled expression. He suggested that simply taking away their inheritance and kicking them out of the house should have been enough. He didn't understand why I had pushed them to the point of such a violent end. I gave him a dark look before answering. I revealed to him that his mother's tragic accident had actually been a cold-blooded murder. I told him how Ava had lured Hannah to a dangerous site, while Ethan ensured the truck's brakes would fail. They had conspired together to remove the only obstacle to the Harrison fortune. I struggled to keep my voice steady, but the decades of hatred I felt for them still leaked out. I told him that I could still vividly remember the horror of finding Hannah broken and bleeding after the crash. That image had been burned into my mind forever. I confessed that I had dreamed of killing them both every single day for the past 25 years. However, I had forced myself to be patient because I wanted to witness them destroying one another. I wanted them to suffer far more than a quick death would allow. I admitted that I had specifically arranged for Ava to work at that restaurant because I knew Ethan brought his dates there. I wanted to create the perfect environment for their final, explosive confrontation. I had been the architect of their mutual destruction. Weeks went by, and our lives finally began to settle into a new and peaceful routine. However, the quiet was suddenly interrupted by an unexpected phone call from the clinic. The news I received was something I had been waiting half my life for. The lead neurologist told me that Hannah had finally regained consciousness after all this time. I was so overwhelmed with emotion that I could barely process the words he was saying. After 25 long years in the dark, she was finally awake. I rushed David and Mrs. Harrison to the facility as fast as I could. We found Hannah resting in her bed, looking frail, but remarkably alert. Her eyes were bright and clear as she looked at us for the first time. She gave me a weak but beautiful smile and joked about how much I had aged since she last saw me. I felt a surge of emotion that made it almost impossible for me to speak. I just stood there and held her hand while tears filled my eyes. I told her that we had spent every single day of the last quarter century waiting for her return. I turned toward the door and gestured for Mrs. Harrison and David to join us by her bedside. It was the reunion we had all dreamed of. Hannah shifted her attention to the young man standing behind me and asked who he was in a gentle whisper. I looked at her with a smile and told her the truth about her son. I wanted her to know everything about the life we had made together. I explained that he was the biological child born from the genetic material we had preserved all those years ago. She was shocked for a moment, but a look of profound love and acceptance quickly spread across her face. She looked at David with a gaze that was full of pure motherly affection. She looked at him with all the warmth of a mother meeting her child for the first time. She asked me what name we had chosen for him, and I told her his name was David. She repeated the name softly to herself with a beautiful smile on her face. Hannah let out a soft and happy laugh while looking at our son with pride. She whispered that he was a truly handsome young man and reached out to take his hand. Our family was finally complete, and the long nightmare was finally over. Ava finally opened her eyes and returned to the world of the living. Everyone likes to believe they are the ones moving the pieces when they are actually just pawns driven by their own dark desires. In the end, James did not win the satisfaction of revenge, but instead he reclaimed the woman he had lost so long ago. Just because someone attempts to use you as a tool in their game does not mean you are destined to play that role. There are moments of waiting that are truly worth the sacrifice, while there are certain people who simply do not deserve your time. I truly hope you possess the clarity to tell the difference between the two.